Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we have fun and we like to share the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Díaz, and I teach philosophy here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon. I'm a philosopher and teach at University of Texas at El Paso.
And today our guest is Dr. David Raley. Dr. Raley grew up in the Houston area and studied at the University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M University, and the University of Houston, where he received his doctorate in American history in 2011. He joined the faculty of El Paso Community College in 2012 and has enjoyed living in El Paso with his wife, Taryn, and children, Olivia, Will, and Michael, since that time. When he's not teaching, Dr. Raley enjoys fishing, traveling, and exploring the history of West Texas and New Mexico. He previously worked in the publishing industry before becoming a historian. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Raley. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
So we usually start off general kinds of questions and we have fun with the big questions, right? So from your background in studying history, what do you think history is? What is the phenomenon called history? What is that?
I think history is taking the past and making it usable, making it understandable. I mean, the past is sort of everything that happened, and then the history is our story, our interpretation of what happened, and trying to make it relevant or understandable to people today. I think that's one of the jobs of an historian, is to make sense of all of the things that happened and make it relevant as best we can.
And why is it important to study history?
I think, the old kind of cliche that, it helps you to understand the present is very much true. The past gives you, or history gives you, an insight into how we got to where we are, why things are happening. And for me, I always had an intellectual curiosity about the past, and that's why I wanted to read as much as I could about it. But for modern people, for most people in the community, just making sense of the world around us is something that history can help us with, I think.
I think that's one of the reasons why I also have studied philosophy, to try to make sense of the current circumstances, try to understand.
I have a related question, so I'll start going down rabbit holes already.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So do you think that, given your initial answers, that it's the study of the past and making sense of the past and see where we're coming from, to perhaps better understand the present, do you think that it's the case then that the more I know of past history in general, and perhaps particular kinds of history, the more I know, the better I can chart a responsible path in the future?
It might be possible for an individual to do that. Students do ask, what's going to happen here next election. I don't like predicting the future because I find that people really don't learn from the past or from history. It's not exactly repeating it, but we tend to make the same mistakes, I think. But I think an individual can benefit from studying what has happened and what has come before, and consciously choosing to make better choices. I don't know that people in general, unfortunately, do that.
This is an interesting path you took now. We're going to jump down another rabbit hole because would you say then that kind of an attitude on your part as a historian, would you characterize that as a kind of pessimistic view of the human role in the historical process, and that from your perspective as a historian you see...
Are you a fatalist?
you see humanity...
I'm not a fatalist. If I was, I really wouldn't be involved in education.
Right.
I think people can improve themselves.
They can improve themselves.
Yeah, I don't know.
But
how
I
about
agree with
history
you.
in general?
No, and I agree with where you're going, because it seems to me that it's I can see how previous generations make that mistake, but I've noticed too that it seems like even if we are told, hey, watch out for that, whatever, we've dealt with it, it's almost like we have to find out for ourselves. And then
I think so. Having children, you learn that. You can tell them
don't touch
all
it.
your wisdom, but they tend to need to make mistakes.
On their own.
And I think people in general are like that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Is that pessimistic? I don't know. Maybe it's more pragmatic.
And that's what I was thinking, when you said to make it useful, I thought that's so American of him. Right?
Yeah, actually, I just finished teaching Schopenhauer, so I have Schopenhauer's pessimism in my mind that all life is suffering. So
well, that's quite extreme. I tend to think of myself as an optimist and try to be positive. But
well, to find use is optimistic, to make it useful.
Yeah, I heard that remark very early on. What can we find useful in what we've learned? And how does that help us in the future?
Because I know a lot of useless things, but I do try to make it relevant to my students as much as I can.
To drop some names, part of the philosophy that I've worked a lot with has been American philosophy. John Dewey, James, Peirce, and for them, back in the late 1900s anyway, when this was getting off the ground, it was, what's the use of the idea anyway?
So you're familiar with the term pragmatism?
Oh, very much. I am in that school. I got...
Kim cut her philosophical teeth on pragmatism.
Yeah. So...
And she has a picture, a framed
I had
picture of Dewey.
That's funny.
On our fireplace mantle.
Yeah.
Competing with a picture of a German philosopher that I had on the other end of it.
Wow.
So I'm very much... Yeah. And I went to Texas A&M because there's two, but there used to be a heavy duty, one of the heavyweights, John McDermott there, of American philosophy.
Yep.
I want to bring it back to you. How did you come to work with history in the way that you do? Because you said you've always had an intellectual curiosity.
So I grew up, I grew up in the suburbs of Houston. I actually grew up in a town where a lot of the NASA astronauts lived. It was very middle, upper class. And my parents were professional people. But my dad actually grew up, their family, they were sharecroppers in the South and very poor. And then he grew up and worked and went to college and had this very unusual story. But used to tell me those stories of growing up in the Depression era South, picking cotton, and they didn't have electricity. I mean, very poor. And then it was so different than the life I grew up knowing later, in the 80s. And it always piqued my interest to understand how we go from that to late 20th century, post-World War II prosperity, and hearing the stories of growing up on a farm. It was just, I always got interested in that, and I tended to read a lot as a kid and read history and science and all kinds of things, and I was just very intellectually curious. Then I decided I wanted to be a history professor when I went to college and kind of stuck with that. Took me a while to figure out what I was going to be a professor specifically of. I actually went to A&M to study military history, and then it wasn't quite my cup of tea, so it took me a while to find something else, but eventually got interested in regulatory and business and did that at U of H.
How did that work, going from Texas A&M? Was that department more military history oriented, and Houston was oriented in a different way?
In
Did
business?
you transfer?
Yeah,
Is business oriented in Houston? That's right.
So Texas A&M, military history is one of their strengths.
Right.
I didn't really love the department. I don't want to say anything bad about the department, but it just wasn't quite for me. I finished my master's, and then I went and worked several years in publishing. And then after a few years, I decided, well, I want to finish my degree, and I didn't necessarily want to go back to A&M. So I started looking into Rice and U of H. And U of H had some really good, interesting faculty. They were doing different things. And even then, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, but I went and found a professor that I could work with and got interested in energy and regulation. And and after having been in the business world, that was a lot more interesting to me than military. I don't necessarily have a military background, so a little bit in the family, but not myself personally. So it kind of dovetailed with what I knew.
Having been in the business.
Having been in the business world a little bit. And publishing is kind of blessed with not being regulated at all, really. But as I dealt with some bureaucracy in that business, I remember dealing with companies in California and they would ask me to fill out all these forms, and I remember one, I was going to contract with a company, and they wanted me to fill out about a half an inch worth of forms because they did some business with the state. And I thought, this is silly. I'm not doing this. And I told them, I don't have time for this. And that always stuck with me about the costs and the effects of regulation. So
to who? To everyone?
To everyone involved, because it cost that company business, and it would cost people time, and there's always a cost. Even if it is in the public interest, there's a cost associated with it, even if we don't consider that. So.
I think there's a cost either way.
Absolutely.
Are you more anti-regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think if the
depends.
Goals of regulation are the right goals, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I don't want to drink dirty water or breathe dirty air. So I'm not opposed necessarily to regulation, but I guess the question is it in the public interest, or is it furthering some other goal? When you have people saying, oh, we're going to regulate coal out of business, I'm not sure that's necessarily in the public interest. But when we're saying we want to clean up the water and clean up the air, and that's much more of a proper goal, in my opinion. Maybe they're not mutually exclusive, but.
Do you, this leads us to the next question. What do you think are the borders between history and philosophy? Right, being our show, Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, what is the border with La Frontera between these two disciplines? What are the differences and similarities?
That was, I think, the toughest question you had for me. Historians tend to have a field of study, and I think that we can find parallels with philosophy. A lot of historians want to study just certain aspects. History's gotten very specialized to where you have people just focusing on one event or one group of people. I try to take a very holistic view. There are historians now that really only try to emphasize overlooked people, marginalized people. I think that's very important, but it's, in a sense, you don't want to limit to just one specific group of people. So I try to tell different kinds of stories, particularly when I'm teaching. And I'm not an expert in contemporary philosophy either. I know the most about perhaps Greek philosophies, but you have these mutually, sometimes very hostile belief systems that you might learn about in a philosophy class. But there's very different ways to approach history. So I tend to view history through an economic lens and use economics to explain why things happen. And it doesn't explain everything, but I think you can get a long way.
Well, that's Marx, right?
But I'm not a Marxist historian, but yes, I tend to.
Marx reduced everything to economics, basically.
Yeah, and you can't explain everything using economics, but you can explain a lot of human behavior using economics, self-interest. You can't explain religion necessarily through economics, but
he would argue otherwise.
He would argue otherwise. I would say no.
Right.
Well, it was kind of dismissive. This is a fascinating turn, right, to go from regulation to the philosophy and history question.
Well, but Adam Smith too, not just Marx. You know, we've had. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm studying this philosopher named Hannah Arendt, and you probably heard her name before. She came up with the banality of evil, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she has this philosophy of history that is directly anti-Marxist. And she says the same thing, you know, right at the beginning. She says, this chapter is going to be a critique on Marx, and the first thing we have to understand is all of our life and history can't be reduced to economics. Just like that's just flat out, you know, that was her starting point, right? You know, which didn't, you know, find favor for her in the intellectual left.
Right.
Because then she thought, everybody thinks if you're not Marxist, you're reactionary, right? Mm-hmm. So, but it's an interesting thing you say, you know, an interesting observation you make. You can't explain religion from a Marxist perspective because religion has so deeply affected our social consciousness and even our political structures in ways that are not directly economical. Right?
Absolutely.
You know, they're idealist, they're inspirational, you know,
No,
they're all embracing, they're metaphysical, but they're not necessarily economic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or
so that was really nice.
Right, and this is one of the same in philosophy. There's really specialized areas, and then there's many different ways of doing philosophy. So those are similarities. Do you think that we can get to the truth by studying history? This is off the.
But that's jumping ahead.
Well, we can put it. We can come back to it because
we can
philosophers.
Get down the road for sure.
Yeah, you know, because I know philosophers. We want to know the truth, whatever that means, right?
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to your comment about, or your confession rather, that your area of, perhaps your first love in philosophy is Greek history. That kind of thing.
You know, I've taught humanities, so I have a passing knowledge, but I could not engage in a kind of a serious debate with either of you about those. But it always struck me that you have, you know, cynicism and Epicureanism and these practically contemporary movements or ideas, and they were so violently opposed to each other and just one from the other, and they thought the others were just totally unhinged in how they viewed the universe.
Yeah, because my question
they
is
made each other drink hemlock if they disagreed with.
But my question there is rooted in kind of like in connection with your response there, is that do you find in studying these kinds of ancient artifacts of history, these ancient stories, these ancient remnants or whatever, lessons to be learned for our contemporary ways of understanding?
One thing that studying history has taught me, I remember this hit me as an undergrad. I was in a I think it was a Roman history course. It was a classics course at University of Texas. And it struck me that these people were all kind of similar to modern people. They had similar motivations and fallacies and prejudices, and that people really hadn't changed that much. I mean, they kind of have, but people didn't change a lot, and that has always stuck with me. And no matter how smart they think they are,
we're still human.
They're all about the same, and across the centuries, and that comes out.
The hubris, right?
The hubris, another Greek term. I remember I had a class, and I forget which class it was. One of the professors, he brought in, it must have been a slide, it was way back, and he had a picture of Herodotus, the father of history, right, the first real historian or whatever. And then, and he said, okay, this is Herodotus, the father of history. And this was a graduate course, and we all knew Herodotus. We'd read a little bit, at least, of Herodotus. And then he put a picture of Thucydides up, and he said, "Oh, this is Thucydides. He's the first revisionist historian, because he corrected Herodotus's work." That always stuck with me. Is that there's always more to do and new interpretations, and no matter how smart people are, there's
we're fallible.
They're fallible, and contemporary people seem to think they're smarter than everyone that's come before them, and I think that's a fallacy too. It scares me when I meet people who think they're smarter than
every generation seems to think that we are, right?
People that have come before, and we all do that, I think. And it's dangerous.
Yeah, there is this kind of, especially with the ascendancy of the STEM disciplines, there really is a kind of dismissiveness of taking an interest in not only the human sciences, but specifically in history, in disciplines like philosophy and history. They become, even though it's mandated to teach history, it's more and more a regulated mandate, So.
Yeah, I think the humanities are so important for understanding the world around us and just critical thinking, and boy, that's tough sometimes to work on in the classroom. I was teaching a class earlier, and eking answers out of students can be challenging at times.
Yeah.
What do you think about this? And sometimes it's well, what's the right answer? What is the factoid you're looking for? That's kind of...
It's that response, or the other response is, I really haven't given that much thought because I'm thinking about my accounting exam that's coming up next.
Yeah, and I think we're all guilty of that. I remember as an undergrad having 50 other things on my mind and sitting in those Roman history classes.
Yeah, I actually think it's the priority thing, though.
Yeah.
So we have to take a history course, or we have to take a philosophy course, and it's not like that's that important. It's just like a filler.
It's
For a lot of people, it is.
For a lot of people.
Yeah. I always say I try to. Well, like some days, some classes I will say, I wish we could run this class like, the Romans would teach a history class. Is that we would sit.
Eat grapes
outside by the fountain and talk history, and then you'd go your way and I'd go my way, and we'd all be better people. But I have to give you a grade, so here's how we're going to do it in this class. And
I want to come back to the truth. Can we trust historical accounts? For instance, the history of the American continent, or really for that matter, any continent, right? The history of the American continent is told differently by Europeans and American Indians or Africans. Yeah, so I guess kicking it down the road was just over to the next question.
Okay.
Can we get to the truth? Can history give us the truth? Can we trust historical accounts? And even like right now you said, right, Herodotus and Thucydides.
Neither is considered a bad historian. They just have a different way of looking at the ancient past. If you're talking about sources, can we trust sources? I think generally yes. You have to take into account who's writing, who's creating the source, and to what purpose, and what their biases may be. Everyone has an agenda up to some point, so you have to be familiar with that. Objectivity is a goal, but it's not always easily found.
Is that something you get taught? That there's these a range of perspectives on, say, one historical event, right? Is this something you get taught, or is that something you kind of brought to the table yourself?
I had several professors that emphasized objectivity, and in several graduate seminars, and that you have to be skeptical of sources. You have to try and understand who's creating the source and what their agenda may be,
right?
And not to take anything is gospel just because it's written down or some person wrote it.
Right.
And that everyone can be and often is biased to some degree, or their point of view may not be really how things were. So I read a lot of sources, and I have to be careful to just ascribe the honest 100% truth to that person. It's tough. It's tough because you maybe you do get a little cynical because you start looking for the angle and everything.
Mm-hmm. No, it's the same in philosophy.
Why is this written the way it is?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have come pretty far. I mean, we understand that these documents that are written were not, somehow coming from the pen held by the hand of God, or, remnants of kind of mythological sort of orientations. But, there is something to be said about, having kind of a healthy amount of skepticism, because we know about, the power of rhetoric, right?
Absolutely.
And the power of kind of selective analyses. You select something to focus on, and then this is the version that actually happened, and I'm a historian, so you can count on me telling you the truth, right? These are the cause and effect relations in the events, right?
It's a temptation, I think, and it's kind of easier. I've had students that will ask me, what's the right answer? What really, I'll present different things that are happening, and what's the right one? Well, depends on the way you want to view it.
Yeah.
The American Revolution is a rebellion against British rule, but it's also kind of a civil war. You got Americans fighting each other, so it's not wrong to interpret it in both ways, right? There are historians that see the American Revolution as the first civil war the United States had.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different way of looking at it. It's also a rebellion against British rule. Neither of those is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of how you want to look at it.
Yeah.
I use the duck rabbit. The duck rabbit. There's Larson. The Far Side.
No, yeah, the Far Side. Love it.
He has this great comic where it's one troop on that side and the other troop on this side, and it's kind of like a medieval looking, both of them troops on their horses, and one of them is holding up the duck and the other one is holding up the rabbit. The caption says, "We will not surrender we will not give up until they accept our rabbit." God, right? It just depends on how you look at it.
Right.
Well, do you think that it's possible for historians to be objective? I mean, you said no, we all have a bias, but would we want them to be objective? So knowing that everybody has a bias, why do we continue to seek objectivity?
I think objectivity is a goal worth working toward. I try to present differing interpretations of things that have happened in the past. You need to be open to new ideas and new interpretations. I think there are historians who are not objective and they have an agenda and they don't try for that, but the best histories I have ever read there's always been an attempt to be objective and present whatever subject in a detached, neutral way.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend a few years ago, and she was asking about some contemporary event, and I really didn't want to give her an answer because I'm not necessarily objective when it comes to contemporary politics. I think I said, ask me in 50 years, and I'll give you an answer, something like that. So I think the further away we get from things, the easier it is to be objective.
Yeah, I just finished this translating co-translating a book with my son. It's called Hegel and the State. And one of the more striking lines that he comes up with in his philosophy is that history becomes the judge of history.
Historians, yeah.
Yeah. So he's a philosopher of history, you know. So he has a perspective and an agenda on reading history, but he said this is, in the long run, history will tell us, you know, who is telling the right story.
And historians are not necessarily shy about judging others many years after the fact, other historians. So there are, you know, historians that were held in high regard at one time that have really fallen out of favor. And that happens. You know, you get new interpretations, new data.
New politics.
You know, contemporary events influence, obviously, how we think. So, and I try to bring a little bit of that in the classroom. You know, I'll say, oh, if we were talking about this 100 years ago, here's how it would have been. And over time, it has changed to where we are now. You know, slavery, the interpretations of slavery tend to have changed dramatically over the past century or so.
I was thinking of Booker T. Washington, right, and which was great, but then Du Bois comes along and others and say, no, we don't want, that's short-sighted, right, because...
I talk about Washington, and sometimes the students are kind of upset.
Booker T. Washington?
For
compromising?
Because he's essentially saying we should accept segregation and work behind the scenes for economic advancement and offer stability to employers, you know, worker acquiescence and a stable workforce. And I think in time the idea was that with that success and that respectability would come the advancements that he was looking for. But that doesn't sit well with a lot of people today.
Right.
They see it as Uncle Tomism or whatever you want to call it. And you know, he was trying to find a way forward at a time when there wasn't a lot.
That seemed to be the only one.
There wasn't a lot of things you could do as a black person.
To even just get education, you know. That's
what
he was
did,
trying to
and where
do.
the way he rose from, well, he was born into slavery and into a position of, you know, directing an institute of higher education. It's pretty remarkable. And I mean, there probably weren't more than 100 people in the United States who had that kind of success in his background. But yeah, I've noticed that.
So
modern folks tend to look very critically at that.
Yeah, but then at the same time, we don't understand where he was coming from and what he was dealing with.
It's very hard to understand how people thought in the past and the circumstances they found themselves in. And
what led them to say what they did.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a lot of that going on, that kind of thinking. We still have colleges and universities that are Hispanic majority or African American majority or traditional black colleges, which I imagine in order for them to keep going, they have to argue something similar, you know, to their constituents. You know, even though we're, you know, voluntarily segregating, this is going to train you to become better and achieve longer term goals, right? Something like that.
Maybe. I think there's some, in my experience, it can also be preserving the history of that culture and paying more attention to that, you know, African history or Chicano history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah, I see where you're going.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that absolutely is the case. But I think there is also this other element.
At one point, I think, yeah. So here's the next question. For minorities and women, how is learning about their history significant beyond studying the traditional Western narrative? So why would somebody go to Bethune-Cookman, right, as opposed to
or Howard
Texas
University.
A&M?
Well, I think you're going to get a different interpretation of the past. So we have, I have colleagues that specialize in borderlands history, and that's, they focus on this interplay between the United States and Mexico, and then the unique culture that develops. And you get a different perspective. That's not my background, so I have more trouble speaking to that.
Though, one of the things I like about American philosophy is this impetus for pluralism. William James is the one that really argued in the favor of pluralism, which is, in a way, what you've been talking about. Let's be skeptical of the different perspectives, but be open-minded to hearing different perspectives.
Absolutely.
One of the things I like about American philosophy, anyway, is this open-mindedness, right? And I maybe Peirce talked a lot about fallibilism, so knowing that we're fallible, looking at different points of view, because I don't have all the answers. I'm not omniscient.
That's where different historians can come in and speak to different aspects of the past. And, again, historians tend to write about what they're interested in or what their backgrounds lead them to. So the great thing is there's always more to explore, and you have to explore new things. Really, as the discipline has expanded, and you get new scholars coming in and wanting to get a doctorate, you have to write about something new.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go and write, or it's more difficult to write another history of, the D-Day landings or something like that. You're supposed to go and kind of plow new ground.
That's research.
Doing research. And so, studying the history of underserved people is a very fertile, can
Mm-hmm.
be a very fertile field. In fact, in some places you can have it practically all to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very tempting for historians. So there's always more scholarship, and there's more to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And to find traditional narrative. I don't know if I guess there is a traditional narrative. It's been a long time that historians have really tried to, kind of dig out the forgotten voices and elevate them. And it's a process that's ongoing, and there's more. The history profession has become a lot more diverse, and a lot of historians are trying to find those where the gaps are. That's why you read other historians, so you can find out where the gaps are, and you can look at and filling those gaps.
Do you think that people of color or different ethnicities, can they learn about their history from white professors? What does history tell us about this?
I sure hope so. It must be true that you can. Otherwise, the reverse would be true, that white people can learn from non-white people, and I don't think that's true. Everyone has something to teach, and again, that goes back to being objective and open-minded and willing to learn and listen, and just discounting people because of their race or their politics. You would never do that with a source of history. I don't think you would do it with individuals either. I read sources written by pretty awful people, and they have things to teach us. I have a book I was reading, actually preparing for class, and it's got letters from slave owners to their overseers in it, and it's fascinating stuff. I don't agree with what they're doing, but it's very informative. And again, if we take the attitude that these people can't teach us anything, that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very much running afoul of contemporary society that says we need to get rid of people that we don't like and don't agree with and hide them away. And
for me, it's almost
dangerous.
If you remember the castas during the Spanish Inquisition, right? That in order for you to be considered of this type of caste, you had to have so many. Like if I forget how it went, but it was a blood count. For me, I feel like we would run into that problem of, okay, well, then if no one but a Chicano can teach about Chicano history, who's a real Chicano?
Yeah,
Do you see?
I think you're
so either
really
way,
getting into a difficult field. I'm a big believer in market forces. So if one historian is creating something that's not useful, then other people will come along and correct that person. And that's how history works, is that something is written and then somebody comes along and writes something else. And over time you develop a better narrative. And that's how it's always worked.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to think about the use function, though, because, I mean, if you're reading slaveholding accounts and justifications for how you treat your slaves, at the time those were written, they were probably very useful, right?
These were like private correspondence that I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
And but very different. I mean, you have people that are very vicious, and then you have people that tell their overseers, don't ever beat any of my slaves. So it's interesting, you get very different perspectives within that system.
Within the slaveholding system.
I usually complain about Jules going off on a tangent, but now I'm going to go on a tangent.
Okay.
Part of the success of Bruce Lee was not being a purist.
The actor, Bruce Lee?
Well, yeah, but as
martial
a martial artist, because he took different aspects. Arguably, he was the first. Did you say that earlier? You said you like watching FFC. Do you like fights?
No, I don't. I'm not.
No fishing.
A big
It was
violence
fishing.
person.
Okay.
I like
Fishing.
I like fishing because it's very cathartic and calming, and very removed from technology.
I'll ask later where you go fishing, but
That's one of the challenges of living in El Paso.
Yeah. He upset many people. You know, he lived on the border because he was Chinese, but also, U.S. American. So he got to, much like here on the border, right, see the best and the worst of both cultures. And he thought, well, why do I need to just learn this traditional style and only stick with this traditional style? Why don't I just take this from this and this from that? And so he was not a purist, and so he brought the sport further along than it had been. I mean, at least in my opinion. There are those who believe that he bastardized it, I suppose. But
well, he certainly kind of brought it into pop culture in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just all these movies and just
right.
made a whole generation of people aware of something that had been kind of marginal, I think, before that.
It was very much underground.
Yeah.
And so I suppose it's the same with, that's the danger of being a purist if we were to go that route. Who would police that anyway?
History is very much an open field. I'm actually working with I'm working on an 8-week class.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to start doing some 8-week classes at our campus, and I'm working on an online 8-week class, and I'm working with a designer, and she's asking me, what do we put what content do we want to put? And I said, oh, no. Every historian is going to, each professor is going to put his or her own content, and we can try some basic organization, and she said, this is very different than any other field, because in biology it's, these 10 things we're going to learn or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, what one of my colleagues might talk about is not necessarily what I might talk about.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have some broad overlap, but everyone is going to do their own thing, and that's kind of how we do history, is we view the past in different ways and try to make it accessible in different ways. So I have colleagues who talk extensively military history, and I have colleagues that focus on women or minorities, or I tend to talk about politics and economics a lot. So it's, again, a differing ways of looking at the past, and I think it's all valuable. You might get a very different information set from your different professors, and that's great.
I was going to ask you earlier about that kind of pedagogical sort of perplexity. So in teaching history, institutionally we have limited venues for teaching. It's not like unlimited scope for multiple perspectives.
True. I mean,
So
we really teach surveys, so it's just a broad sweep, and that gives you some freedom within that too.
Right, but even within that, I mean, choosing what to include in a survey is already a selective process.
Absolutely.
Right,
yeah.
so if you're already selecting in your survey, that we have to talk about women, and we have to talk about this border issue, and we have to talk about, totalitarianism. What's left for the rest of the scope of what's all interesting in history and what's formative, right?
Yeah, that's where each professor has to kind of make those choices, and
Right.
and for me, is it holistic? Does it tell the big picture? Is it
Yeah, this is the problem with attempting to fit humanities sorts of learning into the model that you get in, say, science and engineering, right? It's not the same thing.
No,
right?
It's not. There's no skills test at the end of this. It's very, can be very esoteric.
But the skills are different. There are skills. Like there's a skill of withholding judgment.
Very difficult.
A very difficult skill.
And thinking critically, and
thinking
taking
critically.
something and analyzing it, and trying to get behind the scenes a little bit, and why did this occur? Why do you think so and so did this? Or
well, and not only that, it's especially. I think, at least for one thing can be said. I don't know if you would agree with me, but it's an especially heavy responsibility on the historian's part to demonstrate that there's two ways to think about this. There's the person on the battlefield, and then there's the general, and then there's the people who are being affected by the war, and then there's the general shopkeeper down there who's worrying about, his final business tally, right?
Yeah, that's I think fundamentally the historian's job, is to synthesize all that into some kind of useful narrative. Because I have a lot of interesting histories, getting back to, you mentioned kind of the soldier. There's a lot of first-hand accounts of World War II, and it's great stuff, and I try to make use of those kind of things, but what does it mean, or what's happening 500 yards down the beach? I mean, you can't just take one narrative and base everything around that. You have to kind of bring in everyone, and the more you can, the better I think you're going to do, if you can synthesize more sources.
Yeah.
The clearer picture we're going to get.
A clearer picture, and to that end, you want to bring in underserved people, because there's going to be a new perspective, a different perspective. So it's always important to, getting back to your question about women and minorities, absolutely. You gotta consider those things, or you're not really getting the full picture.
Do you have a favorite historical time or historical figure?
I really like to read and write and talk about populism at the end of the 1800s, which is very esoteric. Students have trouble with it because it's very removed from our, these were farmers that were reacting to changing economic conditions and trying to, in some ways they were kind of looking backwards, wanting to go back to a mostly agrarian past. But then they were very modern because they were trying to use the government to force change. They were trying to use regulation to force change that would benefit them. They wanted the government to come in and take over the railroads and take over the banks and do all this stuff to help them out and get involved in setting crop prices. And it's interesting to me because they were, especially contemporary people, kind of thought of them as throwbacks, as these people living in the past. But then they were wanting to use the power of the regulatory state, which was just emerging in the 1890s, to stack the deck in their favor. And so I find populism just fascinating. And then also cautionary because it's, a third party, and then you have the other parties kind of come in and steal all their ideas, and this is kind of what happens to third parties in the United States, which I find fascinating.
Why?
Because every few years a third party kind of pops up, and you find the advocates of those parties, and they come and tell you, we're going to clean up politics, or we're going to fix this problem. And I don't think so, but good luck. I had a boss at A&M who was very interested in the Reform Party. I always tell this story in class. And she sang the songs of praise for the Reform Party, and they were going to clean up politics. And I thought, I don't know, I think maybe not. And then, of course, both the big parties kind of took those ideas, and then they passed a campaign finance law, and then the Supreme Court struck it down, and that was the end of that for the Reform Party.
And we see it happening again and again.
Yeah, it happens over and over in American history. It's just one of those things that, and it's not necessarily wrong, it's how politics are, and nobody has a hammerlock on ideas, so you come up with a great idea and somebody else can use it. That's how it is.
Well, we did get to the kernel kind of your historical interest in regulation. Got a little glimpse of how that drives even your classroom teaching, right?
Yeah, I don't really get to talk about it much because it's really too esoteric for a lot of people. I will talk briefly about it.
Yeah, it's a piercing insight, though, because, like I said, I just came out of writing this book, and that same phenomenon Hegel was dealing with in the emergence of the German nation state. Is that there's that kind of need for regulation on the one hand, and the kind of dismantling of the ancien regime on the other, and this new class of basically agrarian folks entering the bourgeois proletariat industrial class, as laborers, right? So you had a whole different way of understanding how do you regulate the workplace, and
we had to struggle with that.
Land reform,
which we never really got.
Labor reform,
except through market forces. We did get, getting back to government involvement. You have these, essentially land giveaway programs in the 19th century, and then the market forces essentially ran all those people out of business because they couldn't compete. They didn't have enough land. But we had to struggle with those ideas about freedom of contract versus regulating the workplace. I mean, that's always, I like to talk about labor. It's always interesting to me to try and understand how those ideas of freedom have changed. You'd find people back in the 19th century, and they they were very dismissive of unions because it interfered with their right to contract, right to, that one-on-one getting the best deal I can get, and the reverse of that. And then we've certainly moved away from that to, more, later, accepting unions and as a way to kind of stand up for worker rights and protecting freedom as a way to do that. So
yeah, super interesting.
It's an interesting problem is trying to understand how the idea of freedom has changed over time for different people in American history and abroad.
What a fascinating note to end on.
Yeah, I think I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I'm so glad to be here. This is a lot of fun and very interesting.
I'm glad you could free up a little bit of your time
to
talk about freedom with us. Freedom and regulation.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you to our crew. Thank you to our viewers. My name is Kim.
Jules Simon.
This has been our guest, Dr. David Raley, and Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Please join us next time.